Yeah. Oh, we're one here. Hey, everybody. Hello, friends. Always very, very good to see you. I'm Paola Antonelli, and this is Cristina Moschul, and together we are the R&D department of the Museum of Modern Art. And we're very happy to see you here tonight for Salon number 51 that is entitled Off the Record. For those of you who are in the live stream, hello to you too, or I don't know if there's anybody in the overflow room tonight, but we will take questions also from you, and very happily so when we get to the Q&A. So tonight's theme is Off the Record. And I just want to ask you, aren't you surprised about how easy it is to rewrite history, even recent history? It's become so easy to just control that power of visibility, because true power resides in deciding what is seen and what is unseen. And that's what we'll discuss tonight. We have some great speakers, but I'm going to start. Oh, I didn't even take my instrument of power. Here it is. Exactly. I was telling you, the power of being seen or off-seen. So tonight we're going to talk about canceling. We're going to talk about erasing, redacting, keeping secrets, extracting, falsifying, taking down, censoring, shredding. We even tried to get a video from one of the foremost shredding companies in the United States that didn't really talk to us, but it's okay. That means they're trustworthy. So tonight we'll talk about all that, and we'll talk about whether this is still possible, or whether it is enhanced by new technologies. Because, at some point we had this idea that too much information was no information, and so we could give our biometrics because who cares? But right now with AI, there's a chance that not only can be retained and analyzed, but also it could be falsified even more. So it's almost like a hall of mirrors that we're trying to navigate and to control somehow. So let's start with not only the image, but the physical. What you see here is what happened in Hungary in 1956, when, after the Soviet Union gave Hungary as a gift in 1951 a really massive statue of Joseph Stalin. You see it here during the May Day parade in 1956. During the October Revolution in Hungary in 1956, the statue was I can't say deposed. It was cut into pieces using flame torches because it was so big that it was impossible to do otherwise. It was brought down and cut to pieces with flame torches, and then brought to the main to Blaha Luisa Square in Budapest, where people cut it even more. And then it was left there as a memento, as a remembrance of what had happened. Unluckily, that revolution didn't last very long, and the Soviets came back into power, but that was a gesture that was then reprised in the mid-1990s, when, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this weird memento park on the outskirts of Budapest that was organized to remember all of the statues and the bad times during the Soviet occupation. And you see here that what they showed were just the boots of the Stalin statue before it was brought to the square. So it's very strange, because absence is presence. And this really will become also something to discuss when we talk about taking down monuments versus instead defacing them. Defacing is another way to cancel. But talking about Stalin, here is what, we wanted to show this slide, I forgot, but this is what just happened. I mean, yesterday, as you know, Assad left Syria, and immediately the rebels took down statues. This is the statue of Hafez al-Assad, who was Assad's father, and immediately the statue was taken down, and this trophy image went all around the world. So you see the symbolism is still very much there, and what happens is that when the powers that be control what's seen and what is not seen, it's a very cold action. And instead, very often, when that power is given to the people, it's a way to kind of release anger, and it usually is very destructive in a very overt way. This is instead how Stalin would act. So you see this picture here from 1937, and you can see there's a difference between the two pictures. The difference is Nikolai Yezhov, who was the head of the Soviet police, secret police. And all of a sudden, in the next picture, he's no more. And we don't know, probably he was no more also in general. But this is how Stalin used to doctor the pictures. And there's a lot of examples in Soviet history about rewriting by obliteration.
So as we've been working on this Salon, we've been thinking a lot about the ancient Roman practice known as damnatio memoriae, or as Paolo would say, damnatio memoriae, which translates to condemnation of memory. So this was seen as sort of the utmost punishment an individual could bring upon themselves. Upon either their exile or their death, all traces of them were expunged from the historical record. So here we see an example of the Emperor Geta, somewhat erased or chiseled out of this family portrait. But what's interesting to note about this is even back then, I mean, we can imagine how difficult it might be to erase all traces of an individual from the historical record, especially if it's a prominent figure such as an emperor. With him, there's this note about trying to actually take all of the coins that had his effigy out of circulation and the impossibility of that it took them many, many years to do so. So because of this difficulty, many historians actually think that the purpose of damnatio memoriae was not actually total erasure, but to sort of leave evidence of this erasure so that the viewer might meet it, recognize that there is a purposeful absence, and think about why that gap is there, who might have been there, what they might have done to then deserve that. It's also interesting to then think, too, in terms of the overall impossibility of such an action. Today's contemporary historians, of course, have done a lot of work to fill in these gaps that damnatio memoriae has left, which draws us to draws to our attention the fact, again, this sort of impossibility, the impossibility of Romans, of course, being able to control what contemporary scholars have discovered. So today, the closest thing we have to damnatio memoriae would be getting canceled or cancel culture. So although this pre-existed Harvey Weinstein, this was a really crucial moment culturally as he brought the Me Too movement into kind of a viral position. And as the sort of hashtag itself circulated, many other women felt empowered to either bring forth allegations against him or other abusers. Anyway, so this then 2 years later, this was in 2017. In 2019, then cancel culture became, again, very prominent. And an example we can use to think about this would be R. Kelly. So the accusations against him actually existed early in the 2000s, but it wasn't until actually the documentary Surviving R. Kelly came out that he was then prosecuted for said crimes. He was later found guilty. Subsequently, after the documentary was released, his record label promptly dropped him. Many artists who had worked with him removed their songs with him from streaming platforms. And yet, though, there also was a noticed uptick in actual streams of his songs. So what's interesting to think about with this is sort of this idea of too big to cancel. And again, we're returning to this sort of impossibility of total erasure. And again, another example we can sort of use to think about this would be Michael Jackson. Specifically, thinking about someone who has had such a profound impact on culture that the act of total erasure would have to involve then us thinking about, okay, well, do we count songs that are covers? Do we count songs or artists that use samples? Do we count people who are merely inspired by his work? Where do we sort of draw the line in terms of that? And also thinking, too, about each person's personal memories and how that sort of impossibility of controlling the overall kind of cultural kind of conception of these people.
And we can go from too big to cancel to too small to forget, because very often citizens, individuals that don't have that visibility and that power also have less incision, less incisiveness on what can be and cannot be done. To any European, there's like a tender bureaucracy to this document, but it's the document that allows citizens to ask to be forgotten, to ask for their data to be erased from browsers. And you can see, please tick the appropriate box. You feel your personal data is no longer necessary. Or you can say you're a child, you are a child, or you represent a child, or you were a child at the time of data processing. But in other words, it really gives citizens the right to be forgotten. It's very fascinating to see that being forgotten is as important as being remembered. The problem of the Confederate monuments here in the United States, the issue of the Confederate monuments, of course, is a fascinating way to also think of the conundrums of being remembered versus being forgotten. In the United States, there are about 700 monuments of this kind, most of them in the South, most of them erected during the Jim Crow period. And after 2015, after the Charlotte church killings, and after the Charlottesville Rally of All the Rights, and then, of course, after the killings in 2016 in Minneapolis, after that, so many of these monuments were taken down. And to this day, even though George Floyd in 2020 was maybe the most burning of all of these different happenings, to this day, about 160 monuments have been removed. So it really is a fascinating conundrum to think of. Should we remove these monuments and try to excise some of the darkest moments of our history, or should we keep them there and actually intervene on them in order to remember and not reenact these issues? And we'll talk about it later at length. Another big issue that is happening right now, and that in a way makes us think that the next few years will be rather complicated, is what's happening in terms of self-censoring. We have here the 11th archivist of the United States. Her name is Colleen Shaw, and she is already starting to kind of like clean up what is happening on the mall in the museum. You see here, it says that she's planning new exhibits for the National Archives Museum that includes swapping a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. marching for civil rights for former President Nixon greeting Elvis. So this is happening a lot, this idea of self-censorship, and to try and think that also you have to be everything to everybody. She says, she's quoted to be saying that to be successful, it is imperative that the National Archives welcomes and feels welcoming to all Americans, which means Americans that want to erase and obliterate and forget all of our wrongest deeds. So this idea of like cleaning up and leading people to self-censor, because she was actually installed by Joe Biden, is quite alarming. Now, of course, we know that culture is the weapon to erase whole populations and to erase moments in history. And the bans of books in so many schools all over the United States is as alarming as the book burning in Berlin. That can be in 1933, that can be a way to also remember how we can move forward. What happened also in Hong Kong is that the first people that were brought by the mainland China government, brought down, were book sellers. So books are important because culture really is important. And the whole purpose of these R&D salons is to prove that culture can be the R&D of society. So it is important to protect it. And books are a symbol, perhaps, but they are a powerful symbol, as are also monuments, symbols that are even more evident. Now, religious wars are very complicated. And we Roman Catholics are responsible for what happened during the Crusades, and there's been religious wars everywhere. But in the case of the Crusades, it was the Roman Catholics trying to obliterate the rest of the world to install that particular religion. And here, instead, the Taliban is trying to absolutely obliterate even their own culture. And the Bamiyan Buddhas were taken down in 2001 upon an edict by the Supreme Mullah, to erase all monuments in Afghanistan, to kind of erase all the memory, even the memory of the religion and other religions that were there.
Continuing off this idea of thinking about the kind of vulnerability that exists once a memory is sort of erased, and implicitly then the kind of power imbalance in thinking about when that memory is replaced, the control that is exercised over that subject, a wonderful or very interesting case study to think about is the idea of brainwashing, which was actually invented in 1951 by Edward Hunter, a journalist reporting on the Korean War. And he came up with this as the only sort of logical explanation for why Americans, under questioning by the Chinese and Russians, had admitted that they believed in communism. So to him, the only explanation possible was that the Russians and the Chinese have figured out how to brainwash people, which is essentially removing memories and then replacing them with new ones. So the CIA, having heard about this, promptly began their own sort of experiments and studies. Were unable, of course, to figure out how to do that. And by the 60s, it was largely disproven by the scientific community. However, by that point, it had already latched itself in sort of the cultural subconscious, in the sense that it then became a tool actually for censorship. So if we think about the 60s moments of the rise of cults, radical political extremism, and religions, Americans actually used brainwashing as a way to kind of disenfranchise and, again, censor these people who had radical thoughts that opposed their own. So it was sort of this defense mechanism that continued to perpetuate despite the fact that it had been largely disproven. So moving a little bit to the contemporary moment, but still thinking along this theme of sort of, as Paula had mentioned before, this oblivion through excess, or this sort of layering and the kind of erasure that causes. This is a personal and somewhat exposing example of my camera roll and the 30,000 photos and 1,523 videos that I have. And just sort of thinking about the ways in which today's technology have created a world in which it's so easy to vastly document every aspect of our lives that it somewhat becomes irrelevant. So like thinking back, I'm sure we all have had the experience of going through sort of family photo albums. I remember each year of my life kind of documented in this finite material framework. Now that being replaced by this such an immensity that it's almost impossible to kind of go back and look through. So again, it's this sort of forgetting or this oblivion through just such a vast accumulation of excess. So this actually idea has its roots in the origins of photography. So Louise Daguerre's 1838 photograph, you can see here, this is the first time the human figure was actually captured in a photographic image. It was at that time very difficult to do so, because typically cityscapes would be rendered in such a kind of eerily empty way, just because moving bodies, automobiles, anything kind of in motion was essentially enabled to be kind of captured by the camera. So again, we're thinking about, if you think about sort of this constant stream of data, this light hitting the lens kind of rendered itself invisible just because, again, of that motion. And then within 20 years, the technology had advanced to the point where then we were able to kind of capture these bustling city scenes. So again, kind of bringing it back a little bit to the contemporary moment, thinking about, again, the ways in which this oversaturation, overexposure sort of, in a way, creates, as Susan Sontag talked about it in her last book in 2003, a desensitization towards especially images of violence and suffering. So she talks about the ways in which, since we are so overexposed to these things, we almost dehumanize the people that we see and separate ourselves from that suffering. In this publication, which we'll hear actually from the editor a little bit later, Real Review, in their most recent issue, they opted to replace images with blank image boxes and simply had the alt text descriptions there. This, again, was done in an effort to sort of fight and combat against this desensitization, especially now in relationship to the images coming out of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and instead replacing them with purely these descriptions. And we can see these kind of ideas most clearly articulated in the piece by Hiroshi Sugimoto, who quite literally goes into all these various theaters around the world, takes one long exposure photograph, and allows the kind of film to just play. And again, if you think about, it's just this constant stream of data that renders itself illegible and kind of self-erases and obliterates itself from the record.
Similar but very different in meaning is this picture by Idris Khan. Idris Khan's picture that is every page of the Holy Quran photographed and superimposed upon each other. This beautiful and very spiritual image that shows some remnants of times where the parchment was used many, many times and where everything collapsed together in memory and in presence. So it's the same but different. It's like talking about white being all colors and black being the absence of color. And it's very different. You can always count on artists to kind of go through all the different categories of whatever we're talking about. And that's why we're having these salons. This is the famous Robert Rauschenberg erased de Kooning drawings from 1953. De Kooning gave Rauschenberg mean that he was a very complicated to erase drawing that was made with ink. And so it took about 40 erasers for Rauschenberg to get to this point where the absence is the celebration of a presence onto itself. And it's a very powerful and puzzling piece, as is the one by Marcel Broders, and a throw of dice will never abolish chance, and which is a Stéphane Mallarmé poem that is reproduced. I mean, Stéphane Mallarmé was already playing with very experimental text, with voids and with fills, and Broders does the same, but instead of images, instead of words, he uses this like black bars, the redacted bars. So it's, even in this case, a rhythmic countenance between being and not being, absence and presence. Much more literal and much more also haunting are the different paintings of redaction by Jenny Holzer, in particular this one, Orwell Yellow versus White, which shows on canvas, on linen canvas with oil paint, a reproduction of the pages of the redacted files from the government on George Orwell. She did it on so many different personalities, but the ones about George Orwell are also filled with this irony of one of the most, of the heaviest critics of the government being treated that way. And to the right, Steve McQueen's end credits that show in a long video the documents on Paul Robeson, the star theater actor and civil rights activist, African-American, of course, the files that the FBI was holding of him. So there's a long pan over all these files that are heavily redacted also, and a voiceover that actually reads them. So it's really a meditation on this idea of redaction and erasure of citizens themselves by the powers that be. Trevor Paglen, on the other hand, is trying to unveil and reveal these sites of surveillance. This is a station in Virginia that uses the moon bounce that helps with surveillance, the kind of surveillance that bounces information from the moon and back. So it is all about revealing what is hidden. And then, of course, this great piece by Arthur Jaffa, Redaction, from this year. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's quite fantastic. It's the scene of the brothel from Taxi Driver, reshot by Arthur Jaffa to, at first, his first instinct was that when he went to see this movie as a child, as a teenager, he felt that the Harvey Keitel pimp was black. He felt blackness coming from him. And then when he dug deeper, he realized that indeed the pimp was supposed to be black and instead was made into a white man, but being Harvey Keitel was this figure that almost transcended because of, and then he reshot this scene with black actors. A really powerful way to think of the fact that this kind of so-called fake or deep fake in reality is deep truth. So it's also wonderful to see how obfuscation can lead to truth. And we're going to end with this monument by Esther Shalev-Gertz and Jochen Gertz that was installed in Hamburg in 1986. It was a monument against fascism that started out being 20 meters high. It was covered with lead, which gave me the chills. And people were actually invited to write on it and to comment on fascism. And slowly but surely, this document disappeared into the earth until it completely dissolved. So this idea of overwriting as a form of exorcising the past. And in the end, the monument disappears. So it involves, it kind of condenses all of our discussions. So to talk about all this in a much cleaner and deeper way, we have 4 great speakers tonight that are, in order of appearance, are going to be Matthew Connolly, and then, sorry, I have to get to the right page, and then after him, Julia Weist, Mabel Wilson, Eduardo Cadava. They have great backgrounds and CVs that we hope you have already read, because we're not going to waste time reading all that they have achieved. And then in the meantime, we'll also have a few videos, and we're going to start with the first video that is going to be by New Models. I don't know how many of you follow their podcast. They're fantastic. So let's go with New Models, please.
Elagabalus was a teenage Roman emperor who, for 4 short years, turned the seat of Western civilization into a carnival of transgression. After he was assassinated by his own guards, it was decreed that his existence be wiped from recorded history, formally subject to damnatio memoriae. Statues and monuments were destroyed, his name chiseled out of stone inscriptions. Yet somehow, 1,800 years later, his face is tattooed on the arm of a guy addressing a MoMA salon about damnatio memoriae.
Unfortunately for Elagabalus's dissenters, damnatio memoriae never really works, because while the innovation of writing enabled the very concept of linear history, what actually gets carried forward as history has always been contingent on something beyond what gets written down. We remember things that are affectively potent and narratively dynamic, characteristics shared by great heroes and villains alike.
Elagabalus persists in the popular imagination because his story is a good one, his persona a powerful attractor. Are there any tattoos of Theodosius II in the audience? Didn't think so. But Theodosius reigned for 42 years, his contributions to the Byzantine Empire extensively documented. You can destroy a statue, burn a book, or cancel someone on social media, but you cannot erase the collective unconscious.
In the age of neural media, this is equally true, because even if every conceivable piece of information were ingested by a large public model, it would still be the organic human networks, driven by gossip and storytelling, desires and fears, to access certain information that would ultimately determine what the model understands to be true.
And yet, large language models are still just text. As it was in the beginning and always will be, humans make history. That is, unless we stop talking to each other.
And I would like now to call to the podium Matthew Connolly.
Thank you so much. So I'm a historian, and I guess it was about 13 years ago, I started working with computer scientists and statisticians because I realized that, with all the millions and millions of documents that were declassified, many of them heavily redacted, it was getting harder, to do history. And I came up with the idea of a declassification engine. And so I talked about it a bit, and it got a little bit of notice, and then some lawyers noticed, and then I stopped talking about it. But, people kept talking about it, and at one point, an artist created this concept of what a declassification engine would look like. And I love this image because, if any of you wanted to pay for such a thing, I would love to build a declassification engine. But in the meantime, I thought I would take a few minutes to talk about what I'm doing with what we have and what we have to work with, the stuff of history when you're trying to do the history of American covert operations, military expeditions and whatnot. What you have, among other things, is the Foreign Relations of the United States. So it started getting published all the way back in 1861, and more recently, it was codified in law as something that the State Department is obliged to produce. They're supposed to do it 30 years after the fact, and it's meant to be a complete record. It's one that's meant to be accurate and thorough and so on. But it's not just that, right? Even just for the United States, leaving aside all the other, foreign ministries and intelligence agencies and so on, we also have this process, a declassification process, and that is governed by executive orders. So with few exceptions, like nuclear exceptions, it's really the president who's sovereign over what is secret, what the rest of us are allowed to know. and what we could get prosecuted, for revealing under the Espionage Act. But every president has, in issuing these executive orders for several decades now, specified that declassification should be automatic, right? And even during the years of George W. Bush, it was meant to be automatic after 25 years. Except, if any one of these 9 different exceptions applies. And because of this whole set of exceptions, it is anything but automatic. And over the years, when the Foreign Relations United States series is produced by this team of historians at the State Department, more and more of those records are not just redacted, more and more of them are withheld completely. And as you can see, the number of documents that you can examine, as an historian, if you want to reproduce or recreate or explore even, the history of the 1940s and 50s and 60s and so on, it's less and less every year. So if you wanted to explore the history of the 1970s, as we'll do in a moment, as you can see, we have far less to work with, than we did even for the beginning of the Cold War. So it doesn't make sense because we know the original documentary record is expanding exponentially. I mean, classified information, like all other kinds of information, is growing tremendously. At one point, when they were still counting, it was estimated that the US government produced 93 million secrets a year. 3 times every second, somebody decided that something was something you shouldn't know, at least not for 25 years, at least. Now, what's even more interesting to me is that in more recent years, these are the central foreign policy files. This is like the very, like it sounds, the very center of record keeping about American foreign relations. A lot of what ends up getting withdrawn, withheld, was never classified to begin with. And so, we don't even have, in these millions of examples, because it's about 1 million records every year, even back in the 1970s, all we have is metadata. And we don't even have that for the top secret records. So what is to be done? So here's where the declassification engine comes in. And really what we're talking about is a code base and a database. We have accumulated the largest database of declassified documents in the world. And I work with data scientists in trying to figure out what we can figure out. And so this is one of the first experiments, and it's still my favorite. Basically, a computer scientist built a classifier that was meant to predict whether a given State Department cable would get withheld or not. And what they found was that if the single word boulder appeared anywhere in the metadata, like the subject line or the from or the to or what have you, it was 139 times more likely that that would be withheld. And you can see over time like how it goes down, and up and down, and eventually there's nothing. So we get some sense that there was something going on. We just don't know what it was. But there's other ways. This is a Gephi graph. Like all of us have seen these kinds of graphs. A lot of times they don't tell us very much. But in this case, it tells us a few things. One is that these weren't just State Department records. They were communicating in many cases with the FBI. And a lot of those other nodes in the network are places like Cairo and Damascus, right? So they're Middle Eastern capitals. And then finally, some number of those records were released. So we had some of the body, that is, of these messages. And what you find, just with a simple word cloud, is you find a lot of the information in there was biometric information, recording the hair color and the eye color and the height and all the rest of it, of these people who were trying to get visas to come to the United States. Because it turned out that Boulder was a covert operation where anyone who had a last name that sounded like it might be Arabic would get investigated by the FBI, right? And this was secret at the time, and it was eventually revealed, and it became controversial, and then it was shut down, right? And now, one reason why we only have a few of these records is because in 2002, the White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, decided that limited official use records, that is, ones that are not classified, not secret or top secret or even confidential, they too had to be examined and re-examined. Because after 9/11, he argued that a lot of information that wasn't previously classified was highly sensitive and could be useful to terrorists. And that's how a lot of these records that were never classified ended up getting withheld. And it's an example of how this history in this case is surveilling a community and treating them as terrorists, is history that was incredibly valuable, I think would be at that moment especially, but was denied to us. All right, all of what I'm talking about depends on some part of the documentary record getting preserved, right? Even in redacted form, even if it's just metadata. But in 2020, I found out about something that normally none of us hears about, even historians, which is that there was a controversy where the National Archives had been petitioned by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, where they were asked, as they must, according to the Federal Records Act, to give permission so ICE could start destroying records. And the records they wanted to destroy, were not, mundane kinds of records that one often has to get rid of. It's estimated that some 97% of the official documentary record ends up getting deleted. But in this case, these were incredibly sensitive records, that were very much in the public, eye, because of the horrendous things that were going on in these detention camps at the time. And so here again, this is unusual. Over 20,000 people, including dozens of congressmen and congresswomen, petitioned to stop the National Archives from allowing ICE to destroy these records. And they made a few changes, but still they decided that records related to mistreatment, the medical abuse of detainees, records relating to people who'd been sexually abused in detention, these records could all get destroyed after 3 years. Now, why? Because the National Archives decided that the anticipated research use will be more contemporary rather than many years into the future. Apparently, future historians wouldn't care about such things. They were controversial, but they weren't historically significant. All right, so what happened? Well, luckily, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington filed a federal case. They made a federal case out of it. The judge, temporarily at least, stopped ICE from destroying any records pending this litigation. And eventually, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics won. They actually won their case, which is incredibly rare. They had to show how a federal agency had ignored their own statutory requirements, right? It was arbitrary and capricious, but it was too late. ICE had defied that federal order, and they had already started destroying these records. And this, to me, is the most interesting thing. Look at when they did it. November 2020, right? So this is just a record from the ICE Inspector General about how it is that these records, they were just going to use a sample to decide what was really going on, and they found significant numbers of those records they wanted to sample were already gone. And the man who was in charge of ICE, the acting director, when they first sought the destruction of these records, is going to be the next border czar under the second Trump administration. So with that, I leave you. So the court of history, in other words, is closed. All right, thanks. Yeah.
A reminder to be alert. Next, 2 videos by Joshua Craze and Tamara Nees.
What can you read in a redaction? When I began my research into the War on Terror, it was as if I was sat in front of a jigsaw and it was full of holes. I hoped to find the fugitive pieces hidden in redacted documents. Sometimes, I would stare at a heavily redacted page containing only a single phrase, like a lonely survivor of a government campaign to eliminate all the witnesses, which, in a sense, is exactly what such phrases were. If you took all the efforts of journalists and activists during those benighted years and poured them into a single mould, then our purpose was to cast light where the government wished there to be darkness. We treated the redactions as absences. As my work continued, I realized that redactions were presences that produced their own narrative structures, and by ignoring the way the redactions created meaning, we replicated the stories the government told. The redaction of all torture techniques except for the waterboard in the documents resulted in a narrative, both in the document and in broader public debate, that was focused on the waterboard and not on anything else. Increasingly, when I stared at the documents, all I saw was the black. Instead of treating the redactions as absences, I began treating them as presences, with a content all of their own. My Grammar of Redaction, exhibited at the New Museum, was an attempt not to unveil the contents of the redactions, but to trace the logic of the veiling itself, the way the redactions form their own code. In the beginning of my work with redacted documents, I'd wanted to complete my jigsaw of the world. That didn't resolve the real problem, which was that the world is full of holes. The redacted man writing the documents and the obscure sites of state control were not barriers to getting the story. They were the story.
No matter how many solutions to mortality emerge, technologies die in the same way that people do. And it's the moments of breakdown in the face of death that provide a glimpse of the networked relational labor behind digital production. The death glitch is not only a point of breakdown, it's also a potentially transformative moment, a kind of aesthetic surprise. The failure to perform as expected can be strategic and productive in its own right. How do you capture the history of movements and entities that haven't been fully saved by the archive? That is a methodological question that haunts my work, particularly as screenshots become my imperfect way of archiving fleeting field sites from the ephemeral web. There's a fantasy now, especially with generative AI, that we can safely become post-user, that capitalism can perpetuate itself through bots alone. But there are all of these points at which it becomes clear that humans and material infrastructures, including maintenance workers and caregivers, data annotators and content moderators, alongside data centers, cables, and servers, are always there behind the scenes. The idea that our digital traces can live on in perpetuity through individual mind uploading, that our data belongs only to ourselves, disavows these ecologies, these relations, and ignores the realities of climate change that will make digital preservation increasingly difficult. There is a monumental clock being built on Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos' land. It's meant to last 10,000 years, expanding our collective sense of time. But what are the chances that the Earth as we know it will survive that long?
And now I would like to call to the podium Julia Weist. I was saying, yeah, that's your slide.
About 5 years ago, I became really interested in the concept of the public record. So this is the framework in the United States under which certain information legally has to remain transparent and free and accessible. So it's the public record, how we know that through nonprofit filings, Glenn Lowry made more than $1.5 million in compensation here at MoMA in 2022. The public record is how we know that Beyonce gave Hillary Clinton $2,700 in 2016. It's how we know that I got 4 parking tickets in 2017, and that there was a squirrel census done in Central Park in 2018. You get the idea. So the public record is very broad, it's very diverse. The common denominator is that it's been determined that it's in the best interest of the public for this information to be freely accessible and legally protected. In 2019, I was given an incredible opportunity to physically embed within the public record created by the government of the city of New York through a residency program. So this, at the time, was 243,000 cubic square feet of material in pretty much every format you can imagine, dating back to 1653. So within this embedded position, I made 11 artworks, drawing on material from the collection. And I was very careful to make these works in a systematic way, using the resources of this government-funded residency and a process that I designed with government workers to make sure that these works themselves were classified as government records and therefore legally protected. So on a practical level, that meant that the physical artworks folded back into that physical record that I showed you images of. This was actually shown at MoMA recently, maybe you saw it. But also that members of the public could use the Freedom of Information Law to request the release of these artworks. So here's a screenshot of one such request in 2020. And the government had to furnish these requesters with high resolution digital files of the artworks, which were then made publicly available online and therefore accessible to everybody. So after spending all of this time thinking about the public record, I became fascinated with the idea of the other side of the coin. Is there a private record? And if so, who has access? What does it contain? And it turns out there is a very simple answer to this question. The answer is yes. And among the individuals who have access to the private record are licensed private investigators. So of course, I did what any artist would do, and I applied to become a private investigator. So this was a really extensive process. It involved taking a test, which I passed, an FBI background check, which I also passed, and giving a ton of information to the New York State Department of State about my professional experience as an artist and research and investigations I had done in that capacity. So I was approved in November 2022, and once I was a licensed private investigator, I got access to what's technically called sensitive non-public information about my fellow citizens. This might not surprise you, but in America, the private record is controlled by corporations. For example, IRB Search, which is an affiliate of LexisNexis. So I began making artwork with this data. This was the first piece that I created. It's a self-portrait of data that I purchased about myself, including, you can see in the detail, the orange paper is all the money that I made in every pay period between 2003 and 2004, which I, of course, purchased 20 years later. This is handmade paper that I made from shredded documents from a different database. So this is information about all of the Aries, that's the zodiac sign, Aries, that live in my town, including their dates of birth, the state of issue of their social security number, and where they've lived for the last 30 years. This is information about everyone who owns the same car as me in my town, including lease and loan information about those vehicles, like, for example, what bank owns the loan on a car, previous vehicles that they had registered, those license plates, etc. And then I started making a series of works with another tool that allows you to search by license plate for vehicles on the road, receiving images in response. But I quite quickly realized that there was a loophole here where you could search for any text. Not supposed to happen, but as artists, we look for loopholes, and this is one that I found. So here, I searched for the word proud, and I received a really large subset of data, of which this is a small subset, of cars with proud bumper stickers. And what you're seeing here is satellite imagery of where those photos were taken before they were served to me. So this is a search on the word believe, and you can see there are almost no cars in any of these pictures. What we see instead are lawn signs, throw pillows on people's front porches, even clothing. So this detail is somebody wearing a sweatshirt with the word believe. I don't have to tell you that this could be used to search the ideological affiliations of Americans, political lawn signs, Planned Parenthood bumper stickers, you name it. So I wasn't interested in simply documenting this surveillance. I wanted to intervene in this system. And I learned so much about how the surveillance took place that I was able to do so. So here I sat on the street in Brooklyn in a place I knew would be surveilled. I ran the license plate of the car I was sitting next to, and I purchased this image of myself. I also staged interventions next to or on cars that were confrontational in nature or poetic in nature. I was thinking about this as sort of sediment gunking up the system and allowing me to respond back to the gaze of this surveillance. So I'm going to leave it there because I know we're at time, but one of the things I hope we can talk about tonight is, in addition to who controls the record, what does it mean if there's more records than we're even aware of? How does that play into the dynamics that we are going to discuss tonight? So thank you.
And now 2 videos by Charles Broskowski and Jess White.
I'm Charles Bruskowski, one of the co-founders of Arena. We're sort of notoriously bad at describing Arena, but one of my favorite ways to describe it is playlists for ideas. When you make a playlist, you're using your intuition and personal taste to make a collection of existing media, bits and pieces put together to present a semblance of a whole. Arena is essentially a communal file system. People create channels, which are like folders that can either be public or private, and use them to build collections of text, images, PDFs, links, essays, videos, etc. The social part of it is that you can use any previously saved public content to build your channels, and other people can also use your public content. Arena started 13 years ago, and even though we're technically smaller than similar platforms, there are over 32 million pieces of content saved. We consider Arena to be a lifelong project, but we're also interested in how resilient and redundant the data can be. One simple way we do this now is to make channels immediately downloadable. A person can easily save a local copy of their research to their computer. Some next steps are to build automatic offline access and the ability to sync with third-party storage. But these solutions are akin to local computer backups. The real challenge is to give redundancy to the connections and context that the content has been imbued with. What's the best way to make a network of meaning sturdy? We don't have outside investors, so we maintain our independence and focus on existing for the long term. Our business model is stable, and our resources grow naturally alongside our member base. Our ideal outcome as a company is not becoming the next Facebook. It's becoming the next Nishiyama Onsen, a hot spring hotel in Japan founded in 705 AD, one of the world's oldest businesses.
I'm at the data center at my work, and it's loud, but I'm here because I think this space is a good reminder that keeping everything is not as easy as it seems. I'm on a floor filled with people whose job it is to take care of all this. It's invisible infrastructure that sustains our archives, and it comes at a cost: energy, effort, labor. You ask, why discard anything? And I think because selection is our duty. We discard because keeping some things causes harm, particularly to people who don't even know they are here, who didn't consent to being here. We discard because some things were never ours to keep in the first place, and doing so ignores those boundaries. And we discard because everything we keep creates labor. For us, yeah, but also for researchers in the future. And what's the point of curation if there is no selection? Otherwise, you're just shoveling. Throwing everything in a data swamp is not preservation, it's not care, it's negligence. Our field, my field, your field, is built on principles and ethics, and we make our decisions based on those. But without choice, and selection or discarding is a choice, there can't really be ethics, there can't really be care. So I think discarding can be an act of empathy because it considers the people who are behind or within the records. It considers the people who keep the records, and it considers those who will one day seek meaning in them. Thank you.
And now I would like to call family and friend of MoMA, Mabel Wilson.
All right. Thank you. Can we forget the crack of the whip? The cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniel, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from the mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten by these horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will. That is what Isabella Gibbons remembered about slavery. Gibbons was a school teacher at the newly established Freedmen's School in Charlottesville, Virginia, and she included her recollection in a letter published in March of 1867 in an issue of the Freedmen's Record. She also recounted how white Southerners believed erroneously that their new fellow Black citizens had forgotten the terrors of enslavement. She was witnessing white Southerners concoct the myth of the lost cause of the Confederacy to which they would erect monuments to honorable soldiers across the South, thus whitewashing the truth that their treasonous war to continue trading and owning slaves. Gibbons offered a bold corrective to refute the grand story that slavery had been beneficent and that enslavers were charitable. She recalled for the record the truth. It is believed that Gibbons taught herself to read and write, a skill punishable by beating or even death, as she arrived as an enslaved cook at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville around 1850. Gibbons continued these duties, enslaved by professorial families, until she, her husband William, owned by a different professor, and their children were emancipated in 1865 at the end of the US Civil War. For our memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia, completed in 2020, Gibbons was the only enslaved person for whom the archives yielded a full name, a likeness, a date of death, and her recollection of a life enslaved. Her remembrance, in fact, concludes the memorial's timeline that centers the experience of the enslaved community, juxtaposing lives where people learned and loved within a landscape of toil and trauma. Now, it's important to note that the West's memorial form typically represents historical narratives through dates, names, and figures rendered in durable materials like stone and bronze. UVA's records did yield metrics of value such as you see here, extra hands at Christmas, $2.50, that's what they were rented for, but little else. How then, as Saidiya Hartman writes, do we achieve redress through archival evidence, given, quote, the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, end quote, which for her is as close as we come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved. We would have to accept in this instance the limits for what cannot be remembered and known. To design a memorial while addressing the absence of requisite representations of figures and dates and names in UVA's records, we developed techniques of what I call provisional mark-making. So for example, in a work that wraps the memorial's exterior by artist Eto Otatigbe, Isabella Gibbons' eyes were carved out of Virginia mist granite by a computerized fabrication process to create a lenticular image. As visitors approach the memorial, Gibbons' eyes appear or disappear based on the mood of the sky and the position of the viewer's gaze. Across the inner arc, we created a genealogical cloud by arraying known and unknown names. For the entire community over its 48 years of existence, we placed 4,000 memory marks. For those for whom the archive recorded a presence, like extra hands, but no name, we substituted kinship relations and occupations. So Isabella Gibbons, Jack, an unknown person, become grandmothers, sisters, friends, and bell ringers, woodcutters, and janitors. Rather than be made evident through the scant, violent details of the archival ledger, letter, or will, the complex and rich lives of UVA's enslaved community unfold in provisional mark-making throughout the memorial, conjuring a multiplicity of future memories not yet known. And yet, other questions emerged for us. What if their absence in the records granted spaces of refuge for UVA's enslaved? So for Unknown Unknown, an installation at the architecture exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2023, we returned to the trove of documents from our UVA resource to construct a sonic, visual, and haptic memorial. Unknown Unknown's 2 videos reanimate the spreadsheets, the historical photographs, the drawings, the letters, the receipts, the ledgers, and B-roll video footage of UVA's grounds. We invited 3 descendants of UVA's enslaved community, Datisa Gathers, Colleen Yates, and Jessica Harris, to join scholars Saidiya Hartman and Eliza Kelly in reading the names of ancestors. Fragments of a data-generated bass note repeats, sounding an atonal archival metronome of known and unknown. And the 2-sided multi-channel video and audio projections are captured on suspended sheets of muslin, a cotton fabric that recalls the domestic labor by the unnamed Black seamstresses and laundresses at UVA. The handmade tactility of the fabric panels transforms ordinary cloth into a memorialized artifact. And by forming a counter-archive of image, fragments, and sound, Unknown rehumanizes the captive and the enslaved by rendering their unknowability into moments of refuge and spaces of liberation.
George, Squire, unknown. Wyatt, unknown. Primus, Holly, unknown. John Edwards, unknown. Robin, William Green. Jack, unknown. Matt, unknown. Betsy Vines, Jack, unknown. Alfred, unknown. Primus, unknown. Jim, unknown. Joseph, Frank, unknown. Daniel, unknown. Zachariah, unknown. Absalom, unknown. Phil, Zach, unknown. Moses, Jerry, unknown. Zachariah, Kitty Jones, Ryland, unknown. Henry, John Smith, William, unknown. Primus, unknown. Jack, unknown. Nelson, unknown. Fleming, unknown. Washington, unknown. Cassandra, John, unknown. Jack, unknown. Billy, Wyatt, unknown. Stephen Bowles, John, unknown. Amy, unknown. John, unknown.
In these two projects, records speak through their silences. Can we forget?
Thank you, Mabel. And now a video by Jack Self.
Hello. The problem of media oversaturation is not limited to images. It covers all forms of communication. And today, communication has become very cheap. As a result, the volume of communication has exploded and its value has collapsed. This is, supply-demand metrics. We find ourselves, therefore, trapped in a feedback loop of diminishing returns where more and more communication is needed to generate smaller and smaller profits. Now, this is a problem for all societies, but especially those with civic spheres, because capitalism is not a system concerned with providing what we need to live or communicating for social benefit, for the social good. It has no interest in breathable air or robust democracy unless by coincidence they are profitable. So essential communication, what I would call essential communication, images and words that are in the public interest, that are of value to our collective humanity, have become commodified and packaged to align with these profit metrics, and this devalues them enormously. The question was, how can we fight against the whiteout that comes from an oversaturation of images? But the problem is not the oversaturation of images. It is the fundamental logic of capitalism itself. It is compromise, conformity, assimilation, submission, ignorance, hypocrisy, brutality. There are grave crimes being committed every day that impoverish our humanity. We're all aware of this. And as long as we live under capitalism, these crimes will always tend towards normalization. For modernity, which is defined by imperialism, colonialism, the theft of labor, linear time, infinite, exhaustive, cumulative surplus, the banality of evil is not a flaw, it is a design feature.
Thank you. I want to thank Paula and Christina for the very kind invitation and for everything they've done to gather us here tonight. I begin with a question. What can memory be when it seeks to remember the trauma of loss and displacement? This question is pressing because it is precisely the trauma of particular events that we are today asked to forget, in the name of other histories and in the name of a presentism that itself condemns memory. To think about this condemnation, to counter it, I want to begin with a date, October 7, a date that has solicited different condemnations of memory, especially memories that evoke the history that contributed to the events of this date. But this date can no longer be just a date. It has in it an entire network of other dates. There is no October 7 without these other dates, which means it must be read in relation to a history, and in particular to the long history of displacement, occupation, violence, and asymmetry that is sealed in it. How can we begin to imagine the histories that have led to this story? Fazl Sheikh's multi-volume set of photographs on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Erasure trilogy, is a rich resource here. Divided into 3 volumes, Memory Trace, Desert Bloom, and Independence Nakba, the photographs explore the legacies of the Arab-Israeli War of '48. From his first visit to Israel and the West Bank in late 2010, Sheikh claims that any effort to understand the region must confront this war and its long-term effects on the divided societies of Israel and Palestine. In his words, the war and its aftermath led to the depopulation of more than 450 Palestinian villages and the flight of an estimated 700,000 Palestinians to neighboring countries, refugee camps, and areas under Israeli military rule. This dissolution of Palestinian society has left a wound that has never healed, end quote. That the wound has never healed means that the violence and ruin precipitated by the war do not belong only to the past. This is why Sheikh insists on the traumatic effects of its legacy. The erasure of this founding violence takes many forms, characterizing the Palestinian villages that were destroyed and depopulated as simply deserted or abandoned, forestation projects that cover the traces of these once inhabited villages, renaming these once Palestinian villages with Hebrew names and eliminating them from contemporary maps, denying the right of return to Palestinians who were expulsed from their homes, and the disappearing of Palestinian life. Because the effort to remember or memorialize the Nakba endangers the myth of origins on which Israel has made its claims to sovereignty over the occupied territories, it is not surprising that Israel criminalized the commemoration of the Nakba in 2011. Taking its point of departure from the Nakba, Sheikh's project evokes the traces of what has been erased, exposing the violence of the same erasure. It interrupts our historical amnesia, counters the condemnation of memory, and transforms our understanding of the conflict by insisting that we remember the history that has contributed to what we have witnessed in its most spectacular forms for more than a year now. Memory Trace presents images of the ruins and rubble left behind by the violence of '48, portraits of Arab Israelis and Palestinians who, having lived in the villages that were evacuated and mostly destroyed during the 1948 war, were either displaced by the war or forced into refugee camps, and landscapes that bear the traces of devastation, loss, dispossession, and displacement. These traces tell us that memory emerges from ruins, from faces that bear witness to mournful histories, from landscapes that bear the scars of filling the Negev and making it bloom. The aerial photographs that comprise this volume show what has indeed been blooming in the desert. We can view the transformation wrought on the landscape by military training camps and military maneuvers, munitions storage, evaporation ponds in mining projects, the forced evacuation and demolition of unrecognized Bedouin villages, afforestation efforts, the clearing and appropriation of the desert, and the expansion of settlements. Turning from the lasting legacy of the Palestinian Nakba of 1948 to the Bedouin Nakba, beginning in 1948 and continuing through 1953, Sheikh's photographs record the processes whereby the traces of their settlements and presence on the land have been erased. Against this violence, Sheikh closes his trilogy with a striking series of juxtapositions. Independence Nakba consists of a series of 65 diptychs, one diptych for each year from 1948 to 2013, that puts together portraits of persons from both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of gradually increasing age, diptychs of 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, until 65-year-old. With the left side of the diptych presenting someone from the Israeli side of the separation wall, and the right side presenting someone from the Palestinian side. The double portraits ask us to think not only about the relations that existed between Israelis and Palestinians before the war, but also about the impossible politics of separation that still today maintains a distinction between Israeli liberation and Palestinian catastrophe. In our experience of the images, our eyes have to choose who they will focus on. While looking at the face of one person, we cannot look at the face of the other. Sheikh here presents the dilemma at the heart of the conflict, the impossibility of looking at both sides equally and at the same time. Suggesting that the conflict involves a struggle between two memories, there would perhaps be no conflict were it not for this struggle over what memory can be or over which memory has more authority or force. He asks us to imagine relations across lines of distance and division. Fazl Sheikh's 3 volumes appear as a training manual on how to read historically, and in particular, how to read photographs in moments of danger. The images trace the contours of an ongoing conflict whose history begins where memory is endangered, where it emerges only to disappear, where it even appears in its disappearance. Even if we no longer believe that memory and commemoration alone can prevent disaster in the future, we are still obliged to imagine a means of remembering what remains without remaining, what destroyed and ruined still demands to be preserved, even within a history that can never enter into history. Sheikh insists that we must learn to read the past, and more precisely the irretrievable images of the past, in a way that, following Walter Benjamin, knows how these images threaten to disappear as long as we do not recognize ourselves in them. We must learn to read historically by learning to mourn, by exposing ourselves to the vicissitudes of a history in which we are inscribed and to which we remain urgently and dangerously responsible because it is we who are at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. That was so beautiful. Don't go away. Don't go away. Let's now call all of our speakers to the dais. Well, every time we have one of these salons, I feel that my ideas are like cats that I am trying to herd when I start asking the questions. But this time more than ever, it's amazing how this discussion brings together such diverse worlds and topics, from, I was thinking normalization to erasure to declassifications. I mean, we can really go through a whole gamut. So it also brought something very personal or very professionally personal back, so especially Jess White's video talking about the responsibility to discard. Lately we've been going through, with my curatorial hat, we've been going through this exercise of trying to deaccession works from the collection because there is so much of our collection that remains hidden in warehouses and that we never show. So I was thinking of this responsibility to discard, and I would like to ask you, Matthew, as a historian that is trying to reclassify what's been declassified and classify what's been, so that's trying to unearth. What do you think about this idea of the responsibility to discard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. A lot of my historian colleagues are very uncomfortable with it, and if you ever visit us in our offices, you might notice, that a lot of us are hoarders. And also, like, when you think of it, the archive itself is we sometimes, some of us think of it as a kind of monument, almost like a kind of tombstone. But really, it's more like a time machine, because everyone who works there has to constantly be thinking about the future. And historians don't typically think of themselves as futurologists. But some of the examples that I gave, I've found that my very dear friends who are archivists sometimes feel a bit defensive, when I show them some of the practices at the National Archives. But the reason why that group won their case was because they showed that the archives had betrayed their own principles. They have this sacred trust, to at least, as best they can, try to imagine, what people will consider historic.
It was an abdication of responsibility.
Absolutely.
It was a betrayal.
Absolutely. And it happened, around the same time, under the previous archivist, David Ferriot, that they were also like altering, in one case, altering a piece that they put on display so as not to upset people in the Trump administration. So there was a political context to this. And, we all of us, I think, are part of this, or should be, when we think about what they're preserving. Because after all, if you think that down the road, someone is going to look back and be able to render judgment, I wanted to show just how impossible that's going to be if we don't, all of us, think about what it is we're preserving and why.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Christina, on to you. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask a question to Julia, since we've had the privilege of speaking with you before and learning about your work. If you might want to talk a little bit about your project in Cuba and how it kind of serves as an interesting kind of foil to what you maybe presented tonight, especially thinking about the kind of off-the-record infrastructure that exists there.
Yeah, thank you. So for 6 years, I collaborated with a Havana-based artist, Nestor Cide, and we focused on the geopolitical situation between the US and Cuba, specifically the US embargo, and how it created this sort of loophole for media where copyright is in a gray area, because if Cuban consumers can't legally pay US copyright holders, can they access that material freely? Can it circulate freely outside of copyright? We traced a really long lineage, 40 years of media distribution in Cuba that began with magazines, paperback books, migrated with media once it became still a moving image, so VHS, VCD, CD, and then up into the internet. Because, of course, after 1959, when the state nationalized media production and circulation, there were limited underground opportunities for media to circulate independently. So there was sort of two camps of individuals that were controlling what could be seen, how it can move, and what the content of those records was. So the sort of contemporary version is called El Paquete Semanal, the weekly package. It's a 1 terabyte collection of media that's aggregated by independent content curators in Cuba to this day, and it circulates through an underground but very supported sort of extra legal system, because it serves a function to the state that when information is censored elsewhere, if this sort of controlled, albeit very large at 1 terabyte, collection sort of replaces some of that information within bounds, it poses less of a threat. So here we have this really interesting look at what a huge population of individuals is consuming on a weekly basis, because it's physically manifest and circulating in this kind of extra legal way. So in that body of work, thinking about also the relationship between the geopolitical factors that influences who sees what, who controls what. It's not as simple as the Cuban state nationalized media production and a group of individuals created a counter narrative. It's the US has had a hand in that for decades. Today, with digital technology, it's continuing to change. So it's a really interesting example of some of these kind of edge cases for assumptions we think we can make around who controls what and under what circumstances.
It's almost as if with your work, you were enacting the declassification engine that Matthew is dreaming of. And so by listening to you, I was thinking that you're dealing really with the invisibility, with the a priori erasure of a culture. Now, I'm thinking also of the whole plight of the African American people. I was thinking of Ralph Ellison and the Invisible Man. So the idea of invisibility is connected to today's discussion and to the role of monuments and memorials. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that in reflecting on the project, and I'm fortunate that my collaborator Mijin Yoon is in the audience, of Howler and Yoon, who were my collaborators with this work. I think in retrospect we realized we didn't have what we needed to actually do a memorial, because you need names and dates, and when your public is telling you, the community is saying, well, we want figures and we want to see names, but then when you get to the archives, it's not there. Like, how do you respond? And that's what I mean. I think what we did was very provisional, but it also showed how the archive enacted a violence, right? The fact that you were property and not a person, that you had no last name and you couldn't be traced, right, is part of the violence that is meant to keep you in that position of enslavement, right? Or in a subjugated position under Jim Crow. And so, archives are politics, right? And they can do a lot of work. They seem benign, and there are these buildings in Maryland, but they actually, they're locuses of power. And I think that's what, all of our work is really, really examining and thinking through.
Definitely power. Christina, on to you.
Yeah. So Eduardo, Fazil's work is so incredible. I think one of the things that draws me to it is the way it invites the viewer to spend so much time with it. It's so detailed and rich, and I feel that's in juxtaposition to what we were speaking of earlier, in which we're confronted with images that come at us at such a fast pace constantly. And knowing a little bit of your other work, I wanted to ask how you would suggest sort of matching the speed at which these images are now created, distributed, and stored, and how we can avoid this sort of desensitization or whiteout that we've been kind of talking about.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm somebody who thinks there should be a slow reading movement as well as a slow food movement. I think that, one of the things that's linked to some of the things that were said earlier, Sigurd Kakar has this gorgeous little essay in 1927 where he says that we've never lived in a world that has known so much, if knowing about itself, known as much about itself, if knowing about itself means having an image of everything. But then he talks about the proliferation of images and the blizzard and flood of images, and how, because there's so many images, we don't have time to read them, we don't have time to think about them, and so these images actually produce a strike against understanding. So that by the time you get to the end of the paragraph, he says, we've never lived in a world that has known so little about itself. So what he's really saying is that what's remarkable about not just Fazil's image, but actually basically any of the images that we're looking at, or materials that are redacted, or things that are blocked out, is that what it requires is our capacity to read what's not visible in what we're looking at. There is within it an entire network of historical relations. And so that in order to read that image, you basically have to start, on the one hand, reconstructing those relations, to say reading what's not visible. A photograph rips something out of a context. So you have to simultaneously contextualize and decontextualize, which is a really hard thing to do, but I think that that's what's required to read historically. Especially in moments of danger.
Mm-hmm. And this is a moment of danger. Questions from the audience. We're going to start. There's the first one here. Where are our...
A lot of the National Archive debates seem to be around not items in the archive, but exhibitions that they staged. Yet we don't really see it as erasure when a MoMA exhibition closes and a new one comes in the same gallery. So do you think there exists a right to extend the time that a physical...
But then how did you link it to MoMA?
You have exhibitions that close and then new exhibitions come in the same spaces.
Yeah.
I might be misunderstanding the National Archive, but it seemed like it was about exhibitions that they put on display.
Well, just to clarify, so the National Archives does have exhibition space, and in fact, that incredible Wall Street Journal expose a few weeks ago was all about this new permanent exhibit and how it is that they thought most of what the National Archives does is preserve, the record of our nation, and that is what is in question when we look at these records disposition schedules and the different departments and agencies and what they're required to preserve and what they're allowed to destroy.
One here. Raise your hand more. Oh, no. You decide. Okay, from now on, I'm not going to micromanage you. You decide. You're the boss, not me.
Thank you. This question is primarily for Professor. Declassified information from the American government to different countries in Latin America. And what's most difficult about working with these files is that they're not searchable. So for example, the 49,000 pages that was declassified. And what I'm interested in the work that you were both speaking about today is how you were building these sort of platforms that are searchable. And I was wondering how you envision these platforms into the future, if they might be accessible or if they already are for.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I mean, having worked in the National Archive, to that question, I've been working on an 18th century, as a historian, project about the building, the use of enslaved, which are very interesting. So those are like the letters, that's where you would find letters from Jefferson or Washington. The ledgers, which start to give much more detailed and financial information, those have never been microfilmed, and you can find them. And then there was a so it's not necessarily transparent, absolutely, in terms of how you find records, how available they are, how accessible they are. Sometimes it's a happenstance of history that somebody takes a cache of things and moves them, right? And it does affect how historical narratives are told. And again, that's why power enters into it and why it's political. So I don't think everything will always ever be available for review, because
the way I first had the idea, that I could work with data scientists and trying to make some of these records more accessible was looking at what lawyers were doing with e-discovery. And so as all of us know, one way in which you can defeat your opponent, is just to overwhelm them with paper. And so, overwhelming, it's just millions upon millions of records. And what's even more difficult is that whereas in the past, the way archivists would preserve and produce the historical record was by trying to preserve the original order of those records. Now it's no longer possible because they come to us for audit purposes, right? So that's why they were designed in the way they were, just to retrieve individual records that allow for filtered searching and such. So what I'm trying to do with my colleagues, and I'm very lucky I have a terrific engineer, Ben Liss, a data scientist, organizations, classification codes, and so on. And they've organized it in a database that allows you, not just to do this kind of filtered searching, but also just to make visible what would otherwise be invisible. So you imagine like the Indiana Jones warehouse at the end of that first great film, you. And so the next version of this, I hope, is going to be a kind of large language model RAG system, where you're going to be able to ask questions in your own voice. And
question also to Eduardo and Julia, because especially you were talking about the 1948 war and what kind of documents remain and how searchable are they and how public are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots of documents that are available, of course, but there are also some that, whether there was a direct order from Ben Gurion to evacuate the villages. And, if you see 700,000 people being evacuated, you kind of don't need the document, right? In some way, you don't need the document to declare that there was an order. Maybe it's going back to Christina's question too, is the modes of reading that are required, let's say, to understand, to read digitized information, data, etc. My argument is that what you get with that we need modes of reading that can match the labor that is required to reconstruct everything that's invisible. So that you can do these data sets. This goes back to the speed question. I mean, that I actually think that we need pre-digital modes of reading to read digital and post-digital phenomena.
Interesting.
And I'm curious as a kind of collective what you might think about that.
I personally think it's brilliant. It's a brilliant idea. You're the slow reading advocate. But I'll let maybe Julia and Matthew in particular talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joshua Crazen, who had a video contribution but is not here tonight, writes and speaks about this well, that it's not necessarily just about the information, that if you could undo a redaction and get the knowledge underneath, it's not going to answer the question necessarily. So in a case like yours where you have, let's say, you said thousands of documents, something like this, 49,000 documents, it's also a thing in of itself. This 49,000, it becomes one thing. And also there's different ways of reading it around tone and language and rhythm, and there's things that you can learn in aggregate. It's a different type of aesthetic, but perhaps in this hyper-contemporary world we're living in, that shift from individual fact to larger reality that can be gleaned through other vectors is something that can serve us well as poets and artists and thinkers.
Yeah, so I think historians are really in a difficult time because we're no longer able, at least those of us trying to do contemporary history, to work the way historians were trained to, where you could open up that file and read those documents in the same order that they were produced and read by the people you want to understand. But on the other hand, we now have like all these databases where all you have typically is keyword search, right? So what do we end up doing? We end up doing a lot of really superficial history. Like it's becoming notorious, that historians will brag about the 50 archives that they visited, whereas in fact what they're doing is they're keyword searching across dozens of archives, just sitting at their desks, right? And making connections that may or may not be real. Whereas if they had to sit down and paw through like box after box after box, they would know that one red herring was really not very important. And so, I've had colleagues tell me, well, I'm kind of a Luddite. I would never use AI. And yet and still, their last book, the only sources they cited were ones in digital archives. They've been using AI for decades. They don't even know it yet. So we really have to think about what rules of evidence we're going to use going forward when we want to test historical propositions. It's all too easy to do really superficial research using digital tools. It's much harder to be a good digital historian because we don't even know yet what that means. Right? Mm-hmm. Professional standards are shifting in ways that we're hardly even talking about yet.
So very interesting. Like Julia and Mabel got their hands dirty for sure. 17th century documents and such. Okay, next question from the audience. There's many. No, it's like. Then the next ones are over on this side.
May I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, what do you think will last longer in terms of records, digital or practical, actual, physical? There's a huge archive of physical records versus the archive of digital records. Looking at it the way you guys do, encountering it longer or shorter, or what's better?
Who wants to take this? Go for it, Julia.
I think one of the things that's interesting about our culture's obsession with speed and growth and change is that there's kind of an erasure through error too, which we talked about excess, but a digital conservationist, and this is a job for sure at archives and institutions will say that a JPEG that's depreciated should be migrated to a JPEG 2000, right? So there's a poignancy, there's sort of a metaphor that because we're so obsessed with growth and change, things get broken and lost and forgotten just as a product of that. That happens less with paper. So that's one thing to consider.
I'll give you one example. The email records of the George H.W. Bush administration are no longer recoverable. They can't access any of the email that they preserved from that period. Now, they might be recoverable, like if they actually had the budget to pay for the people who know how to do the work, but for the moment, they can't read any of those email.
Wow. No, digital.
One of the things that freaked me out a couple of years ago is I discovered, somebody told me, that elementary schools are no longer teaching cursive, right? This completely freaked me out. I couldn't even believe it. I thought they were just making it up. But this means that access to historical archives, written documents, is going to become increasingly difficult. People won't be able to read handwriting. So, but I do think that, documents, we have medieval manuscripts that people are still looking at, right?
So do we have a microphone also on this side? There is, do we? Yes, okay, because there were some people, that side has been privileged. So can you raise your hands still on this side? Okay, great.
Actually, that was almost exactly what I was going to point out. And I'm old enough to remember And I think it was like 1999 when they said the codex was dead, and what that was going to mean for books in general. But that's how all known knowledge is passed on to generations, is these hard copies.
Question?
The question was like, it seems like the speakers are on diametrically opposed lines of understanding, whether it's slow reading or aggregating this an immense amount of digital information. How, even the way it's I guess
What is the question, please?
Like, where's the middle ground? Where is this? Where do you people feel that this is going? Because it's really overwhelming. It's funny, the Mabel, your representation of the unknown it reminded me a lot of how architects dealt with 2000. The trade towers falling and all that water dumping into an empty hole. Like, where are we all supposed to look and understand this amount of information going forward?
So it seems about the oversaturation. Maybe it's perfect for you, Eduardo.
I mean, I would just say that let's say the opposition between pre-digital and digital is a narrow way of looking at information, images, documents, etc. I mean, I'm somebody who works a lot on photography, and people have talked about digital photography and the advent of digital photography and how that sounds the death knell of photography. If anybody knows the history of photography, when you talk about photography, within that history, the discourse of photography always links photography to death. Because when you're taking a photograph of someone, when you have that photograph in your hand, that's the best evidence what you have in your hand is not who or what was photographed, right? So the photograph exists in a mournful relation to what was photographed. But if you're going to talk about the death of photography, then what you're really talking about is the death of photography. So then you're talking about the survival of photography. So that what I really think is that all the philosophical questions that one could ask about photography in its analog form are absolutely the questions that can be carried over into the digital world, right? The relation between truth and fiction, memorization and archivization, presence and absence, memory and forgetting, all these philosophical questions are already there. What differentiates chemicals from information is the intense acceleration with which people can manipulate images, do these things, do data sets, etc. It's a question of the speed with which one intensifies that process. But this is why I think that one needs predigital forms of reading to read this material. But I don't know that we all agree on that.
I don't think anybody disagrees, right?
I mean, part of what Matthew was saying seems to be close to this.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So
I start out like, I want to know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that like some of the methods from AI are incredibly powerful, right, to reveal what's missing. But then, of course, once you start finding things, then to me, that's even more pleasurable, is to sit down and read these documents. And it's already clear, like, one of the projects I'm working on, I have an NSF grant with Vishal Misra, a computer scientist, is to test the mosaic theory. This is the reason why most, in fact, like, in almost every instance, FOIA requests to release classified materials is almost always denied. And it's always with the idea that if you piece together seemingly innocuous information, you're going to reveal something that's still sensitive, that could still get people killed. So we're trying to do that with AI, where it's seeing whether you can piece together like seemingly innocuous information to reveal things that are supposed to be redacted. And in doing that, we can even run experiments where we can bring together all the documents a historian cites to see whether it reproduces the same answer the historian gives, using that evidence. And what we find is it doesn't, because a historian doesn't treat every document as if it was the same. They actually know how to read that text and understand it, and to see that one of those documents might be the smoking gun that explains all the rest. But this is the sort of stuff that I find exciting, and I think we should do more of it.
Mm-hmm. Next. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think this is a question for Matthew, but also for everyone, of course. So with this AI tool, I think that you developed with the computer scientists, it seems that maybe you were uncovering this redacted text with this tool, but then obviously it would be statistical, it'd be predictive. So I'm wondering how you kind of account for this epistemic uncertainty of what those words actually are, as it's not actually historical text, it's something predicted, it's kind of in between, and I'm wondering how you thought about that.
Well, it's actually like existential doubt because I found out when we proposed doing this research that according to some interpretations of the Espionage Act and the Atomic Energy Act and so on, we could get prosecuted just for trying, even using only declassified documents. So that's still, out there. I'm willing to test that theory if I could get enough support to do it. But you're right. Even if we did that, what we would have is like a probabilistic, kind of estimate of the things that are still redacted. But by running the experiment, we can see whether we can reveal the things that we know were redacted previously. And all we need really is to gather enough data to begin running those kinds of experiments to see what kind of results we get.
So I'm going to hijack for a moment to ask Mabel and Eduardo a question about the Confederate monuments. What do you think about the taking down the monuments versus the defacing them or re-elaborating them? I'm going to start with you, Mabel.
I mean, I've sat on different commissions, including one in New York City, about memorials and monuments. I think it has to be a collective decision of the community in terms of what that means and why it should be there or not be there. Charlottesville was an interesting moment. And in fact, the people who were removing the monuments in Richmond were the same construction company that built the memorial we did, Team Henry in Richmond. African-American firm, construction company, amazing. And I think it has to be a kind of collective conversation. However, I think at this moment, civil discourse is sort of out of the windows, so I don't know how it is possible to have that conversation. Personally, I think they should all go, but I think it has to be very, place-specific within a group of people that decide. And sometimes they can be contextualized. I think they could remain, and there could be, sort of other narratives that are, constructed around them. So I just think it's specific to that community.
Okay, that's a good point. And Eduardo?
I kind of want to respond. I was the head of Wilson College at Princeton during the Woodrow Wilson controversy.
Yeah, well, great.
And so I'm the one who ended up removing the mural of Woodrow Wilson throwing a baseball in the dining hall. But I think that what Mabel is saying is absolutely correct. I generated a collective decision, right? So I got together a group of students, some who were for removing it, some who were for not removing it. And during the course of interviews with different people, they decided unanimously to remove it. And I think that I also at that time brought Ruth Simmons, who had been the president of Brown, to talk about what Brown had done in relation to the history of Brown's relation to the institution of slavery, et cetera. And she gave a talk like how to confront a tainted legacy. And they didn't remove the name Brown. They didn't remove things. What they did is they created a research program, exhibitions, et cetera, kind of what you were saying. So I think that it is contextual and that it does require a kind of collective decision. I don't think there's a rule on it. I think that it really depends on what we now have at Princeton a committee that's aimed at addressing what kinds of iconic images get placed on campus. And so it goes through a committee and so on that is linked to this. But I don't think there's a rule. I think it's how you contextualize, how you decide what the removal would mean.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me hijack. And by the way, also, I know that people that are watching the live stream can send questions, but if there's anybody in the overflow rooms, you can send me emails, paola_antonelli@moma.org. So I can ask the questions for you. Next question in the audience, please.
To me, and this connects to what you guys were just saying about removal of certain figures and statues, so on and so forth. Are you in favor of erasing those who have been, for lack of a better word, canceled or deemed unsavory in the current context that we live in? And if so, what's your justification for erasing said figures?
But like what kind of figures is he?
Anyone. I mean, you know, R. Kelly's been brought up in this. I mean, we have many figures in whether it be rap culture, all across culture, who have been deemed unsavory but have significant footprints in culture. And you know, whether it has been someone who has let off anti-Semitic rants such as Kanye West or other figures.
And is it even possible? So
Can I?
Who wants to take this?
All right, ma'am.
Julia, do you want to take it?
I guess I would start with the word erasing, sort of like what is meant by that in this particular context. I think that there is a concept called the total institution that A.L. Weissman and Matthew Fuller put forward, sort of the idea of a cruise ship where everything can be controlled because it's a closed environment. We have maybe no total institutions left or total institutional context. So I think what happens is when erasure is attempted, let's say 95% can be erased or manipulated or contextualized or controlled through some kind of form of mythology or whatnot. The 5% that will always remain is going to be the most important part of that record, and it's going to take an outsized role. So I think as a strategy, it's sort of counterproductive in a way that is perhaps an interesting lens through which to look at this question. The value that gets placed on what is outside the sphere of control and how that becomes the new narrative. It's an organic process of rewriting rather than maybe a deliberative one, so it's a bit peculiar. But yeah, just from a strategic perspective, I think those questions emerge.
There's one question here. That's a very timid arm that you're raising. Oh, sorry, there's somebody else in the back. Oh, the microphone doesn't seem to be working. Oh yeah, now it is. Thank you.
It's on now. Okay. So I had a question regarding, like, when we're speaking about these archives and, like, we're thinking about emerging technologies and having a conversation about saying that we've been having really deep, shallow searches. And my question is kind of through your different fields and the various labor that's required to build this, what needs to really be invested in as you're working through your various fields when it comes to when we're thinking about the future and we're thinking about the type of changes and the databases that we need to be using, what should be invested in the individuals that are working to support this work? Hope that's clear.
Go ahead.
Well, you know, the U.S. National Archives, which when it comes to like U.S. government records, that's where it all comes from, right? In terms of what gets preserved for the rest of us to use in one way or another. The U.S. National Archives has had a budget less than $400 million. It's effectively the same budget they've had for the last 20 years, right? And just think of it. I sometimes compare it to the Veterans Administration, because, you know, after all, like what they're doing is they're trying to, you know, in a way, like kind of deal with the legacy of all America's like failed wars and overseas adventures of various kinds. It all creates an enormous amount of data, right? Like, so the CENTCOM records are just mind-boggling. Coalition Provisional Authority, like just hundreds of gigabytes of data. And so they are, in effect, imagine like a VA hospital, or all the VA hospitals. If they had the same budget now that they did 20 years ago, what would those hospitals be like, right? So that's what the National Archives is like now. I mean, it's just collapsing, you know, under this, you know, tsunami, you know, of information. And then, you know, how else, you know, can we think about what's invested in this? So the National Endowment for the Humanities is the main source of funding sciences because they were thinking of dabbling in digital humanities. And when they heard that the entire National Endowment for the Humanities only put $6 million a year, they almost fell out of their chairs. They couldn't believe it. And they were worried if they came into this field, if they would immediately dominate the field. And I said, no, please, it's fine. You should come into the field. So just, you know, think of it, you know, the US, when they purchase like new presidential helicopters, those things cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, they spend more money on military bands than we spend on the National Archives. So I just think as a society, if we actually care about these things, it's like what Joe Biden once said, if people say they care about something, don't believe them. Look at what they spend their money on, right? And so as a society, this is what we've decided, this is how much we care about our history.
To the maintenance of the archive, and I was wondering if I was very stricken by the idea that care is selecting and editing, and I was wondering, because in my own experience, it's actually very difficult to select and to edit, and it takes a lot of time. So actually discarding and editing is also a lot of labor, as much labor as conserving. So I was wondering, I have like two questions. One is like, what are the criteria of insignificance? Like, how do you determine something is insignificant and needs to be discarded? And the other question is it really more easy to keep than to discard, to select?
Who wants to take this? Yeah, go, Julia.
There's been so many incredible surprises in my archival research that gets to the heart of your question about things that seem so insignificant in the moment that then becomes so significant over time. So, for example, the New York Public Library has this incredible, fully digitized collection of historic menus. So you can see how much a dish like turtle soup cost in 1839, that at the time perhaps wasn't seen as like this valuable historic record, but it tells us so much about so many aspects of how that thing got on that plate into somebody's body. Similarly, in the municipal archives, when I was doing the project I shared tonight, there were incredible ledgers that showed how much wet nurses were paid to breastfeed orphans in Randall's Island. And I mean, both of the examples I just gave are tied to capital, which is just pure coincidence. There's so much beyond that, but the sort of receipts, the ephemera, gives such a texture to history, and that I think outside of some of the larger framings that we all consider in our work around power and what is remembered and what is kept, is a good reminder of something that just takes on more and more value as time goes on because it's less likely to perhaps be recorded elsewhere in a secondary source.
My mom's principle, keep everything. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I do want to add, that those records, there is someone determining what is valuable, right? And there are certain things that aren't legible and visible, and those aren't valued, and those gets discarded. So let's say, women's history of the 19th century, there's probably not a lot because what women were doing was not seen as essentially valuable. And so that still is a lens through which, criteria determine what is in the archive, and then therefore what gets looked upon to basically make historical interpretation.
And it's a discarding or an erasing by disinterest and by prejudice. Yeah, so. Okay, we have one last question. This lady here, the mic is getting to you.
Hi, so I'm feeling a little troubled. I know historically huge masses of important stuff made by Incas or other people have been destroyed. There's a kind of notion that if we only could keep it all, that is our obligation, which I think is not what really good work, as you all do, is about. What it's about is how you might pick up a menu and find it fascinating. It's that connection between the past and the present. I'm someone who worked on Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, which was never meant to be complete. It was meant to teach the present because of how the present connects to that moment in the past. And I'm wondering if you think that, which is the important thing? Is it the object? Or is it you in relation to something of the past?
Eduardo, it's yours.
In 7 minutes you can only do so much, right? But if you think of what's happening in Gaza and what's been happening, there's a genocide, an ethnocide, a domicide, a scholasticide. There's an epistemological side where everything's, and documents, archives, libraries are being destroyed. right? So these things are not going to be available for someone to do something with, right? So I think it's absolutely, when you have an object, it's what one does with that object, how one reads it, and how one finds significance in something that someone else thought was insignificant. But you have to either have the object or have something to read, or you try and reconstruct it on the basis of what's missing, right? I mean, which is to say, you have to reconstruct what's not visible. You have to be able to do that, right? I mean, for example, I'm just very telegraphic, very quick. I was doing a project with Eyal Weizman, conflict shorelines, relation between political conflict and climate change. We took students to the Amazon, but one of the things we were trying to do in this course, it was called Amazonia, Botanical Archaeology of Genocide, was to say that the genocide that took place in Brazil during the dictatorship is now mostly legible in the vegetation or the lack of vegetation. So you have a satellite image. You can read the age of trees if you code it properly, right? So if you see a canopy of trees, a cluster of trees that are younger than the trees around it, you can presume there used to be a clearing there. You can assume people used to live there, right? So it's a way of trying to reconstruct a history on the basis of what's not even there, right? So one can do that, but I think that so many things are being lost right now in particular, right? So I think we need visible things.
And you produce new objects with them that represent all those missing objects. I mean, this is like the perfect closing to this salon, because let's not forget we're at the Museum of Modern Art, and our goal here is to prove that art and culture can really help us through all of these like really thorny issues and questions. And this was an amazing panel that was at the same time intimate and universal and global, with gigantic issues and very personal issues that we touched upon. And I think it will really stay with us. And so I want to really thank you for being such stunning speakers. And and the same for our video makers. Our video makers were also great. And then I would like to thank our whole crew here at MoMA, and then Matthew also for manning the mic. And I don't see you, but you are womaning the mics. And then, of course, my big thank goes to Christina for always being such a great partner. And now, as you know very well, there's soggy snacks and so-so wine outside for you, and we can all stay and linger on and talk more. Thank you so much. Thank you.